Comment le débat sur la prédestination a-t-il rebondi au IXe siècle?
There was a monk named Gottschalk of Orbay, who had been a resident at the monastery at Fulda, the city of Fulda, which is in modern-day Germany. At some point, he wanted out, and he basically quit the life of a monk and went on, but you need to do something else. Well, he's got all this excellent theology training, so he puts himself out there as a preacher, a traveling itinerant minister, and he travels. And he is very, very smart. All the documents that we have about him point to him being an extremely brilliant young man. And he could memorize long passages of scripture and also long passages of Augustine, and could quote them from memory at many occasions. He was fascinated by Augustine and fascinated by Augustinian theology of grace, free will, and predestination. And he latched on to this phrase that the elect are predestined to be so by an act of God's grace, the rest are predestined to death. Gottschalk dared to tread where Augustine would not, and many other preachers would not. And that is, he would bring up the subject of predestination in sermons. And very quickly, people in the churches were troubled by what they were hearing. And news got back to his former abbot at Fulda, a man named Rabanus Maurus, and began to refute them, and then called for a trial and asked for Gottschalk to be brought to him for an ecclesiastical trial so that his ideas could be tested. There's a long story here, but he went through, in fact, several trials. And I think it's fair to say the trials were a bit rigged against him. He was not going to be able to win, but he was able to present his ideas. And the more he presented them, the more he created enemies. And a few people were interested in supporting him. He did gather a few supporters, but many, many more enemies. And he was eventually put in prison for the rest of his life, forbidden to speak or write. Well, he immediately broke both of those rules and continued to write, continued to speak to people who would listen. Gottschalk was teaching what we would call today a single predestination with two effects: that God gives grace to the elect, and therefore we could call them predestined. And those to whom, and so that's the one act of predestination, a single predestination, but it has two effects. The effect is those who get grace necessarily become followers of God. And those who are not given grace necessarily remain in their status as a reprobate individual and earn justly, as a result of their sins, death. And that to him is that when Augustine says predestined to death, he says this is what Augustine meant. So if I think about it, and Matthew, your listeners might appreciate this, you think about being in school and the teacher creates a syllabus for a course. If you do not show up for the final exam, well, say 50% of your grade was dependent on that. So I have predestined the death, if you will, the punishment for the sin of not doing the final exam, right? Let's say if it's worth 50% of the grade. But what I didn't do is I didn't make anybody not take the final exam. I didn't stop anybody from taking the final exam. So I predestined the punishment of a percentage of your grade that would be missing if you decide not to show up. But I don't make you not show up. That's a decision on your part. Does that make sense? So there's a predestination of grace to the elect, and there's the predestination of punishment for ending up as a reprobate individual. But what's not predestined is anybody being made reprobate. God doesn't predestine anyone ad malum to sin, to become a reprobate person. They do that just fine on their own.
Comment les penseurs anciens peuvent-ils nous aider à aborder la prédestination pastoralement?
Well, one of the things I think that, why does Augustine think it's so helpful? When you look at his treatise on predestination and grace, Predestination et Gratia, which he wrote, it was his next to last text that he ever wrote, next to last treatise. He talks about how it increases our love for God. It increases our own sense of ourselves, right? We increase in humility before God, right? We stand before God as sinners and with having no hope within ourselves of saving ourselves. And it's only by an act of God's grace that we become followers of God and that we begin to love what's good. We begin to love what's beautiful. That's something outside of ourselves that has to enter within us. That concept was retained through those conversations at the Council of Orange and the 9th century debates. There was a real concern to just sit in awe of God's sovereign decisions and to sit in awe of what it means for us to be recipients of God's grace. Pastorally, these are subjects that are not really for the typical Sunday sermon. But I think as a pastor, we look at the people before us, we look at those who come into our lives, and we just have to operate on the assumption that they are members of God's elect family, and we care for them accordingly. And we try and take them from where they are now in their relationship with Jesus to a deeper place in their relationship with Jesus. And we trust God sorts it all out.
Comment pouvons-nous prier pour toi?
May you and your audience pray for me and all of us who serve in ministerial or vocational kinds of roles, that we do the best work we can in the hours God has given us, while balancing, of course, also that we've been given multiple sets of responsibilities, and I am the biggest can be the chief among sinners in the area of not always getting that balance right. So I'd be grateful for prayer for being a good balancer of my work and home life and the responsibilities outside of this kind of work. I love this work, but I also have to realize that the moment I leave this, my office, I enter the 21st century. I leave the 4th through the 9th century, and the 21st century has many other pressures and questions and demands that I can't always just expect it to be interested in my 4th through 9th century interests. And so making that pivot is not always easy.